Reading is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. Today's poem is an early 20th century poem by Edmund Blunden. And if you are not familiar with the name Edmund Blunden, he is one of the generation of World War I poets. Blunden was, as such, a contemporary of Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, Robert Graves, C.S. Lewis, at least some of whom I'm sure you've probably heard of. And Blunden, like some of these authors, dedicated a fair bit of his poetic works to the description of war, the soldier's life, and the tragedy of war as he had seen it. This poem I'm going to read to you is not a war poem. This is kind of a meditative lyric about one's ancestry and the mystery that one's ancestors very often, I would say probably universally, are to us. If you think about it, very few of us know anything really about our forebears beyond the distance of a few generations. I would say it's a fairly rare person who knows more than a few things, birth, last name, first name, maybe time of death, profession of their great-grandparents. I myself know a little bit about all of my great-grandparents, but not a whole lot. I can picture three of them, but I can't. For instance, I cannot think of what my mother's grandfather, what either of my mother's grandfathers look like. And as you go to further generations back, the distance, the mystery, the incomprehension only grows greater. And you go a couple centuries back and you might not even know what country they were living in. So this poem by Edmund Blunden, Forefathers, is a meditation about the men who came before him. And it is written in successive stanzas of 6 lines apiece. And the meter is a fairly conventional one. And the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, C. So the first stanza, crook, shade, brook, glade, wit, lit. So the form of the poem is not revolutionary. Neither really is the subject matter. In a sense, it's a very sort of traditionalist type of poem, even though Edmund Blunden is often counted amongst the literary modernists of the early 20th century. So here we go. Forefathers by Edmund Blunden. Here they went with smock and crook, toiled in the sun, lolled in the shade. Here they mudded out the brook, and here their hatchet cleared the glade. Harvest supper woke their wit, Huntsman's moon their wooings lit. From this church they led their brides, from this church themselves were led shoulder high. On these waysides sat to take their beer and bread. Names are gone, what men they were, these their cottages declare. Names are vanished, save the few in the old brown Bible scrawled. These were men of pith and thew, whom the city never called. Scarce could read or hold a quill, build the barn, the forge, the mill. On the green they watched their sons playing till too dark to see, as their fathers watched them once, as my father once watched me, while the bat and beetle flew on the warm air webbed with dew. Unrecorded, unrenowned, men from whom my ways begin, Here I know you by your ground, but I know you not within. There is silence. There survives not a moment of your lives. Like the bee that now is blown honey heavy on my hand, from his toppling tansy-throne in the green tempestuous land, I'm in clover now, nor know who made honey long ago. Some of the images in this particular poem are very, very well crafted, I think. I especially admire the beginning of the second stanza. From this church they led their brides. From this church themselves were led shoulder high. So if you think about it, he's describing the wedding days of these men of several generations presumably, and their funeral days, and the smallness of the world, not the dishonor or the shameful ignobility of this world, but just the smallness, the quaintness of the world that they lived and died in. These are all presumably citizens of an England that was still an England of small villages where the you could say the fundamental life of the nation was lived, rather than in big cities and commercial centers. So this is the England of before the 20th century that he's looking at. Blunden himself was born in 1896. And the rural England was already kind of a thing of the past in his boyhood, but he would have had inherited memories and perhaps even visible experiences of some of it. And Blunden here, I remember the first time I read this poem was in an anthology in high school, or maybe it was college, and I confused Edmund Blunden and Thomas Hardy for a while, because their poems all have kind of a rural, kind of a bucolic and sort of melancholy tone to them. And Blunden is in some ways kind of a later Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy with some World War I experience thrown in. Blunden also he mentions cricket here in the let me see, the third to the last stanza. On the green they watched their son playing till too dark to see, as their fathers watched them once, as my father once watched me. And Edmund Blunden was, in addition to being a poet, something of a sports writer. He wrote a lot about cricket, of which he was, according to his contemporary George Orwell, both a very enthusiastic and a very bad player. So maybe it's true of sports writers, what's true of so many other people, those who can't teach, those who can't participate, write about what they can't participate in. So Blunden, cricket is a theme that he returns to in several of his writings. I think he wrote at least one full-length book study of the subject. Anyhow, so this poem is in an odd way kind of sublime, even if it deals with very everyday people that you wouldn't necessarily remember if your paths crossed with them. But the historic importance of the Smiths and Joneses of the world is, in a sense, even more important than any of the royal dynasties by whom Smiths and Jones' lives are sometimes shaped, often for the better, sometimes probably at least as often for the worse. But the last couple of stanzas, unrecorded, unrenowned, men from whom my ways begin, here I know you by your ground. Here I know you by the ground that you lived on, the ground that you're now buried in, presumably. Here I know you by your ground, but I know you not within. There is silence, there survives not a moment of your lives. And the last stanza is one in which it seems as though he's kind of changing the subject, but he's not. He incorporates this metaphor, this simile, I should say, of a bee. So he's examining gravestones, landscape that marked the lives of his forefathers, and he sees a bee on his hand. Like the bee that now is blown, honey heavy on my hand, says the speaker here. From his toppling tansy-throne in the green tempestuous land, I'm in clover now, nor know who made honey long ago. So in a sense, I'm as ignorant, I'm as nonplussed as this bee that is going about the the honeybee activities that thousands of millions, if not millions, of generations of honeybees have gone about without really knowing how it is that I got here. Here I am, and I'm overwhelmed with a sense of awe, not to name a more definite emotion than that. And I find myself provoked to speech and try to articulate that awe, even if I don't know the full significance of it. This has been the well-read poem. Thank you very much.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron-supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.